Chapter 29. The moment the airlock opened, his air quality sensors tripped again. The lab's air had extreme concentrations of both methane and CO2, even higher than what the tablet had shown for the other Station 3 levels. The gunk on the bulkheads rustled, or maybe that was his imagination. Still, hadn't it moved? Twitched the slightest bit at the airlock's pressure release? Zilf cautiously stepped forward, his eyes flicking between his boots and what was in front of him. The tangle of muck moved. Tendrils, a little larger than the ones on level 4, crept across his lowered boot. Each of the tendrils, no larger than a bean sprout, moved to meet a mate coming from the other side, the pair tangling together before twining with the others. Stand still long enough, he thought, and you'll find out how tough they are. He stepped forward, the tendrils snapping back from his armor without resistance. If he weren't wearing a suit and didn't have nearly as much mass, would he still be able to walk without the things wrapping him up? He doubted it. He reached the edge of the catwalk and looked down. The Exo Lab was a massive open-air facility. A 30 by 30 meter partitioned-off area with the words Specimen Lab stood at the very back of the space, another guard dais propped up next to it. Unlike the lobby for the level, however, he doubted the guards stationed inside the facility had been suitless. In fact, it appeared to him the entire lab was considered a biohazard. Warning signs littered load-bearing pillars and glowed above some of the lab tables. In the center of the room, Zilf saw what looked like centrifuges, tiny ones relative to the massive structures he'd seen at the refinery. Several pipes filled with red water jutted upward from the devices and joined a central dispersal system that ended at the far bulkhead. Water from the ocean, Zilf thought. They were experimenting with the water, but what on? Apart from the gunk growing on every available surface, the lab seemed devoid of life. No humans in red and orange suits walking the aisles, no quiet conversations between colleagues, nor the hum of working instruments. It was as if the place had been completely abandoned and nature were reclaiming it. Whose nature was the question. Zilf turned and studied the catwalks. There were no instruments on this level, no research tables, just the coated metal decks that overlooked the work area below. Guards, he thought. They had guards up here. Made sense, in a way. If you were concerned about some kind of creature escaping a lab or your lab personnel going rogue for whatever reason, armed guards would certainly be a requirement. This was yet another break in Shinshou's standard practices. The company's laboratory policies prohibited weapons in a lab, unless it was an actual weapons lab. That included armed guards. Shinshou only wanted professionals trained in dealing with toxic substances to actually deal with the toxic substances. Guards? Unnecessary in a properly designed facility. Quarantine lock-ins, module separation, alternate HVAC systems, and the like enclosed labs in such a way that if a disaster occurred, only those inside would be affected. Having armed guards would only complicate matters in an emergency. Yet here were the catwalks, and apart from using them to reach the ceiling, there was little need for them at all. So what else could they have been looking for? Zilf scanned the catwalks and found what he was looking for. This gantry, the one he currently stood on, led to a central area in the middle of the room, like a spoke on a wheel. From the center, he could walk to another gantry leading to a lift connecting the lab floor to the catwalks. He sighed in relief. He wouldn't have to go back through the airlock or find another way to the next level, which meant less chance of running into another of the creatures. Continuing to scan and occasionally flicking his eyes to his rear suit cam, Zilf walked the catwalk to the center. The gunk beneath his feet squelched and squirted viscous green goo that quickly stained his boots. His external mics picked up the sound with far too much clarity for his liking, and his stomach rolled. With each step, he felt as though he were walking on a rotted corpse. Why did you think that? He asked himself. The ceiling's recessed exhaust vents, each closed and free of damage apart from the gunk crusting over the metal, looked down on the lab below. Closed. Good. At least he didn't have to worry about something dropping on him, although the pipes running to and fro above the lab area remained a concern. Despite the fact they weren't that large in diameter, he'd already seen the creatures collapse themselves, especially the segmented variety. They might be able to squeeze into a space that small and wriggle their way through, claw through the pipe metal, and appear behind him. The idea made him tremble. When he reached the middle of the spoked wheel, he took a look around at all the bulkheads. Those beneath him had crusted so heavily in places that the growth stuck out nearly a meter and rose as high as 2 or 3 meters from the once gleaming flat walls and coated deck. Were they breathing? He stopped and watched and quickly realized something more disturbing. All the walls were breathing to some extent. He could even see tiny tendrils waving in the air like bean sprouts. The entire lab was alive. Sylph clutched his wrench more tightly, the servos protesting for a moment before settling. "Yuri," he said aloud, external speakers off, "could really use you right now." Or Reki, or Li Xiao, or Griggs. Shit, he'd take a damn trainee. Anything was better than being alone in this alien flesh-covered station. Zilf walked to the lift and stopped a meter from the cage. The growth covered the car's interior, just like the bulkheads. One corner puffed out to the side as if the goo had grown over something that had once stood there. He got a bad feeling. He tapped the stud for the door release and it slid aside, the metal groaning against the alien gunk that had no doubt covered the internal machinery. Zilf eyed the growth in the corner, kept his plasma torch ready, and stepped inside. The interface gave him a single choice: down. Zilf stood to the side of the lift door and touched the interface button before stepping as far away from the clumped growth as he could, plasma torch pointed directly at it. If it so much as twitched, he'd activate the torch and set fire to the entire lift. The gate closed with less complaint, but green ooze drizzled down the lift door's edges. The car lurched and descended, Zilf barely breaking eye contact with the thing in the corner. When the lift touched down, Zilf waited for something to happen, for the clump to move. It didn't, but tendrils from the gunk waved in the air just as they did from the walls. He touched the stud to open the door, and it slid aside almost silently. A maze of tables stood on the deck. Metal partitions sectioned off 5 small offices or meeting rooms opposite the exolab facility. Scientific instruments he didn't recognize seemed to fill every available space, each table or workstation raised so the scientists didn't have to sit in bulky suits. Air stations and energy stations, now overgrown and covered by the flora or whatever the fuck it was, sat recessed in each of the 4 walls. Zilf counted 35 separate workstations, but that didn't necessarily mean that many people worked in the lab. The important number right now was 0. No one. No bodies. No signs of torn suits or struggle. Apart from the alien kudzu creeping onto every surface, the lab might never have even contained people. Zilf closed the cage, turned the corner, and found the refreshment station. You couldn't exactly eat or drink in a suit, not conventionally, but that didn't mean you didn't get nutrients and fluids throughout the day. You stepped up to the kiosk, hooked in, got hydrated and nourishment, and then went about your duties until you felt the need to partake again. No one would be filling up here, though. It was the only damage in the place. The kiosks had been smashed, their contents looted. The green and brown moss-like growth had already colonized the machinery's innards and choked its components. Zilf stared at the broken kiosks for a moment, trying to figure out why anyone would empty the things, let alone smash them open. It didn't really make sense. He wandered back to the enclosed specimen lab and inspected the hatch. It was ajar. After taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door with his wrench, the plasma torch ready to light up anything that came for him. The hatch swung aside and Zilf's heart nearly stopped in his chest. 6 floor-to-ceiling cylinders, each at least 2 meters in diameter, stood inside a room with transparent walls. The trans-aluminum containers, however, were far from empty. The alien moss completely filled the first, the thick aluminum bulging from the internal pressure of unrestrained growth. A feeding tube, at least that's what he thought it was, connected to the top of the cylinder and ran to a dispensing station outside the room. In fact, all the containers had one. The other cylinders didn't contain flora. Red, clear water filled the tubes, a layer of scum floating at the top of each. Eddies in the tubes made the flotsam swirl slightly, as if from a gentle current. From the feeding lines? He wondered aloud. But no, those were empty of fluid. So what was causing the movement in the specimen cylinders? The closest fauna cylinder contained what looked like fish analogs, their bodies rugose and lacking gills, but the tails looked all too familiar. Their bifurcated heads sported dead black eye clusters that reminded him of terrestrial spiders. The fish floating inside their liquid prison didn't appear to be alive, but their bodies should have moved in the gently swirling current affecting the layer of scum. That worried him. Zilf continued inside and shut the hatch behind him. It locked with a loud click, and he immediately felt as though a load had been lifted. He hadn't realized just how paranoid he'd become of something attacking him from behind. No HVAC in here, no vents. He walked around the side of the specimen lab, wrench ready to bash anything that moved. He needn't have bothered. Apart from a few workstations, the area had been completely abandoned. He turned to regard the cylinders through the glass, and his mouth dropped open. The 4 cylinders he hadn't been able to see contained much larger specimens. The thing in the 3rd cylinder had mostly human physiology, although a long, thick tail had grown from the middle of its back and rested on the cylinder's bottom. Its face had 3 distinct sections. The skull a near trapezoid of horrid features, eye clusters on each side. If it had once had a nose, the organ was completely absent. 5 slits on either side of its short, muscular neck fluttered in the liquid's slow churn. Zilf shivered. Without eyelids, it was impossible to know if the thing was sleeping or dead. He wasn't willing to discount either possibility, but best to assume it was alive and ready to attack. How strong were the cylinders? Their surfaces seemed intact and free from scratches or stress marks, although the creature's claws and spine-covered arms looked as though they could easily puncture the transaluminum. The 4th creature didn't have human features. It looked more like something Zilf would have found 10 kilometers beneath his homeworld's ocean, the deep midnight zone that starlight couldn't reach. Those animals usually had features that included deadly spines, open mouths with jagged, dangerous teeth, and a proboscis they used to smash the shells of the crab analogs that scurried across the ocean floor. The difference? Whereas the creatures that plumbed those depths on his homeworld had shrunken, nearly useless eyes and relied upon luminescent antennae to attract prey, this large animal, at least half a meter wide and several in length, had eyes that burned like yellow stars. Zilf cocked an eyebrow. Yellow in the red water. Did that mean the eyes were actually blue? The fish thing's gills fluttered like the humanoid specimen. If the ocean had an entire population of these creatures, what else swam in the depths of Zhaotu's ocean? The 5th looked like something he'd seen before but couldn't place. The segmented thing reminded him of the creature in Station 2, but its features weren't so alien. The creature had a circular maw with fewer teeth than the other analogs and appeared quite dead. No gills. Zilf raised an eyebrow. What was it? The final cylinder contained only a wide, tall dung heap. Like the lockers in those rooms, Zilf said aloud. Why hadn't they hydrated this one? A quick check of the cylinder's bottom showed a red stain. It had had water at one time, but no longer. What had they been doing in here? Curious, Zilf stepped to a workstation and activated the interface. It immediately challenged him for security codes, but none of his worked. The biometric scan failed over and over again, as it should since it had no way to even see his face through the visor. No information here, Zilf thought. He found the 2-meter-tall, 3-meter-wide dead hollow display and activated it, sighing in relief when it came to life. A series of graphs and readouts appeared, displaying growth charts, chemical compositions, and even models of complex molecules. At the far end of the display, he saw what looked like DNA, if it were a quadruple helix that ended in 4 separate horns rather than merely a double helix. Zilf read the legends and titles, most of the terms completely unfamiliar. He wasn't a biologist or a scientist. He was an engineer. Still, he'd had more than enough biology at school to know the molecule was as alien could get. The legend beneath the strange molecule read, Tardigrade Transformational DNA. Tardigrade. The word conjured the image of a segmented, 6-legged thing with a circular maw and a proboscis for feeding. Fuck, Zilf said. You experimented on a known life form? He took another look at the creature in Cylinder 5 and nodded. Tardigrades. Earth creatures that measured mere millimeters in length were found mainly on moss and in shallow water. The creature in Cylinder 5 was a mutated, monstrous tardigrade. Zilf tapped the word tardigrade, and a corner of the display lit up with a picture of a normal specimen, presumably before mutation, a picture of a dung heap in a cylinder, number 6, he guessed, and finally the massive mutant in Cylinder 5. The picture of the dung heap had a single word, exoton. The word ton sounded familiar, but he wasn't sure what it meant. The massive adrenaline bursts he'd experienced while fighting and running for his life had left him exhausted and ready to fall asleep in his suit. Well, he said aloud, Probably safest place for it. He fought the urge to close his eyes. Safe or not, he had too much to do. Griggs could be on any level above or below him, as could Harvey. He had to find them and destroy this place. Whatever experiments they'd been running had obviously infected the entire station. Zilf had no intention of letting anything survive. Chapter 30. Zilf stared in both wonder and horror at Cylinder 6. What was hibernating in there? What would bring it to life? He didn't really want to know. All he wanted to do was walk inside the specimen lab and fry every creature inside. Whatever these scientists had been doing was far more than a sin against Allah, Jehovah, Yahweh, or any other known deity. This was a sin of perversion against creation itself, one no human should forgive. Except stockholders, Zilf said with distaste, although even they might be horrified if it became clear Shinsho couldn't make money off these monsters. Zilf tapped through the hollow display menus looking for one thing in particular: a purge. If he could, he wanted to see these things utterly destroyed before he left the level. Then again, if he destroyed the entire facility, they'd no doubt die when Zhao Tu's formidable ocean crushed Station 3 into a single massive heap of metal. He didn't find any such option. The workstation just outside the specimen lab might have those controls, but he couldn't access it. He walked back to the observation window and looked for another workstation inside. There it was, somewhat obscured by the third cylinder, the one containing the horrific caricature of a human being. Did he dare? Zilf eyed the stud to enter the specimen lab, his fingers dancing indecisively centimeters from the control. There was no upside to walking inside that lab. None. He took 2 steps away from the specimen lab entrance. Turtle had had his 5 minutes. It was time for Shark to swim. After taking one last look around the workstations, hoping against hope to find something he could add to his dwindling supply of weapons, he gave up. He had what he had, and that was that. If he found something on the lower levels, great, but this room had nothing more than horror inside. Zilf turned, made his way to the egress, and stopped. The lab had no atmosphere, so he'd heard no sound. The dents in the hatch's formerly smooth surface told him something was outside the lab and trying its damnedest to get in. A new dimple appeared, followed by another. How many of them were out there? How did they get inside the lab with all the lockouts? The airlock had shut behind him when he entered this level. Had it not been secured? He hadn't destroyed it, so it should have remained closed. Unless the creatures know what it is and how to use it. Oh, that was a nasty thought. The image of the spindly thing that had killed his best friend, activating and using the airlock controls, made his skin crawl. If that were the case, nowhere on the station was safe. The hatch shuddered in its frame, dimples popping out as if dozens of sledgehammers had attacked it all at once. Zilf didn't want the hatch to open. He couldn't see what was going on outside the lab and wasn't sure he wanted to know, but whatever creature battered on the other side of the hatch, it was coming in, whether he liked it or not. When it, or they, entered the lab, he'd have nowhere to flee and little room to fight. Multiple creatures attacking him in such a small space would quickly overwhelm him, forcing his massive suit to the floor while the creatures scratched, clawed, and struck at his armor, inevitably shredding the material before shredding his innards. Purge. Zilf looked back at the enclosed specimen space. There had to be a purge or self-destruct. No way were these scientists dumb enough not to include a failsafe. He jogged to the enclosed space's entrance and tapped a stud without a thought. The internal specimen lab hatch opened. Zilf checked the floor for fauna, flora, and found none. At least that was something. Walking inside, he closed the hatch behind him, suddenly aware there was no way to relock it. Shut up, Turtle, he said to himself, and walked past the aisle of cylinders and to the rear where the lone workstation sat. He brought it to life, and the transparent wall before him turned into a hollow display. The interface showed several options, including specimen readings, cylinder status, and a few other odds and ends. At the very end of the list, a single word glowed at him from a raised button. Purge. Zilf grinned and tapped the button. The numbers 1 through 6 appeared on the screen, as well as another button marked Purge All. His finger hovered over that last for a moment. Each cylinder likely sat atop a tube that led elsewhere in the station, perhaps even to the ocean. If what he planned on doing worked, he wanted to make sure he had as little company as possible. He caught motion out of the corner of his eye and swung his gaze to the lab entrance. The hatch had buckled in its frame, but still held. 3 long fingers covered in spikes and dripping goo curled around the crack in the hatch, searching for leverage. Without thinking, he stabbed the button for number 6. A red light flashed above the exoton cylinder, the feeding tube disconnecting and sliding upwards. The lights continued to flash. Zilf moved forward and knelt at the cylinder's base. The locks holding the container in place spread apart, and the cylinder wobbled for just an instant. The base turned 90 degrees, and a new set of locks clicked into place. A puff of white gas lingered at the base for a moment before dissipating in the vacuum. The base descended into its housing, dragging the cylinder along with it. As the strange specimen disappeared into the hole, a metal door started to slide into place to cover the tube. Zilf grabbed it with one hand and pulled hard. The metal door broke out of its track and he tossed it aside, staring down into the tube. He caught sight of the top of the cylinder before it disappeared into pitch darkness. The tube would be a tight fit, probably too tight for him, but it was the only choice he had. "Watch yourself, Zilfakir," his instructor had said while the new recruits practiced repairing a fusion plasma reactor. The exercise had included EETs perfecting their movement skills through narrow feed pipes and cooling systems. "That heavy can get hung up. If that happens, your only choice is to smash the pipe. That happens?" His instructor had shaken her head. "Might damage something that can't afford to be damaged." "Wish you could see this," he told the mental image of his instructor, "because maybe you'd have some advice." The deck vibrated beneath his feet and he turned to the specimen lab hatch. 2 monsters like those that had killed Yuri had not only found their way in through the hatch, but they were now fighting to get inside the specimen lab, their dead eyes boring into him, proboscises flicking in and out of their open maws. Zilf gritted his teeth, pulled one of the welding fuel canisters from his pouch, and tossed it at the lab's hatch. It hit the hatch and rolled a few centimeters away. He dropped his legs into the tube and wriggled to fit inside. The hatch burst inward, and the spindly things rushed. He lifted his plasma torch and fired a single, low-powered blast at the canister. The blue fire instantly heated the container to well over 500 degrees Celsius, igniting the fuel inside. It exploded with a short-lived burst of light, the air in the canister the only atmosphere for combustion. It might not have hurt the creatures, apart from the spray of shrapnel, but it had made them scurry backwards in surprise. It was the best he could do. Zilf pulled in his arms and let gravity pull him downward. The room disappeared as he descended. He couldn't see where he was going, so he kept his head high, arms stretched upward. He jostled against the sides as he slowly dropped centimeter by centimeter. This wasn't going to work for long. He was too big, far too damn big to go much further. Cursing, he tried to readjust his tool arm. No joy. He was practically a cork in a bottle, impossible to go further downward, and now, likely as impossible to ascend and fight the creatures. What's more, those things could crawl down here at any second and rip their motionless, defenseless prey to pieces. He activated the plasma torch and rotated his arm, the blue flame immediately cutting into the tube's side. The relatively thin metal separated after a moment. Deep breath, Zilf thought, and pushed his arms and legs outward as hard as he could. The metal tube shook and shuddered, the walls bowing outward with the effort, and the cut he'd made widened. He felt the tube tearing, rending, and increased the suit's augmented servos as much as he dared. Something struck his shoulder, and he looked up. There at the top of the open tube, a malformed abomination peered at him, its sphincter-like mouth pulsing and preparing to launch another projectile. Zilf blasted it with his plasma torch, didn't bother watching for a reaction, and continued pushing his legs and arms outward. The section of the tube trapping his body burst apart, the seams finally giving way. He lost his balance and tumbled over the side and fell through one thin metal partition and through another before finally striking a surface that held his mass. The jarring crash filled his HUD with static for a moment, impact alarms flashing yellow. Zilf saw stars, his brain sliding around in his skull from the sudden shock. He rolled to his back, the torch pointed upward in case something came through the tube. For a moment, he sat there, unable to move, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Shark? Swim!" his father's voice said in his mind. Get away. Yes, he thought dully. His lights showed the irregularly shaped hole he'd fallen through, and he realized he'd crashed through an HVAC duct and into the junction between 2 modules. The junction space had less than 2 meters of clearance, meaning he couldn't stand to his full height. He panned his lights around the space and saw the specimen tubes leading through the junction into the module below. After pulling himself to his feet, Sylph pulled his wrench and staggered forward to the tube he'd fallen from. He placed a glove against it, checking for vibrations. "Fuck," he said. After turning to look behind him, he saw the far bulkhead, presumably the module's edge. He couldn't run flat out in here, not unless he wanted to bounce his already damaged helmet into the junction's ceiling again and again. An awkward, hunched jog was the best he could do. With the thudding of his heart pulsing in his ears and a headache lingering at the back of his skull, he gritted his teeth with every movement. Just as the pounding of his heart had become a pounding in his brain, the suit administered analgesics and other chemicals into his stress system. The headache disappeared in a flash, and his blood boiled with energy. He reached the bulkhead and turned. No atmosphere here, no sound. If there had been, he'd have known what was happening above him. Green goo dripped through the hole he'd left in his wake. Half a beat later, a single, multi-jointed arm reached through the irregularly shaped gap and shuffled to and fro as though trying to find him. Zilf remained motionless. If it could sense the vibrations of him moving around, he didn't want to give it a reason to come down here. He had more space to fight here, sure, but again faced the prospect of overwhelming numbers. The arm continued searching for a few seconds before finally lifting out of sight. Zilf's breathing had slowed, the panicked animal sedated by the drugs coursing through his system. He waited a few more moments, almost willing the arm to return and give him a reason to stay here and rest. When it didn't, he slowly shuffled down the bulkhead, lights panning around module supports, connectors for HVAC systems, power, and other infrastructure. Where had he been? Level 6? Level 7? He couldn't remember, and since he reached a module junction, it didn't really matter. Down was where he needed to go. While keeping an eye on the area he'd fallen through, he continued searching for the vaunted access hatch used to maintain the junction. He finally found it after more than 2 minutes of searching. The security lockouts were no doubt in place, more as a standard precaution than to keep actual staff from servicing the area. Then again, the panel looked thicker than normal. He guessed they hadn't wanted anything from above to have a chance to get to the next module via the junction. He held his tool hand against the panel and attempted a connection to the security system. Nothing. No interface and nothing listening. Zilf sighed. A simple ingress had been too much to hope for. After checking his plasma fuel and cursing at the low percentage, he activated the tool and began cutting through the panel's center. He only had to expose the locking bar and maybe break it with his wrench. The impact would cause the deck to vibrate like a plucked guitar string, but he didn't have another choice. The steel melted to slag, and there it was, a single rectangular metal bar that ran beyond both sides of the plate. It didn't look especially thick, and he was certain he could shatter it with a wallop of the wrench, which right now was his only option unless he wanted to expend the rest of his fuel. Keeping his eyes on the area he'd dropped through, Zilf raised the wrench as high as he could and slammed it down. No atmosphere, no sound, but he felt the vibration through his feet. The steel bent, and a corner of the panel buckled. Zilf smashed again, and the supports holding the panel in place cracked. He kicked hard, and the stressed panel bent downward. The junction vibrated again as a shape dropped down near the purge tubes. One of the spindly-legged things had decided to join him. Zilf kicked the panel again, and the 2x2 meter square of steel disappeared as it crumbled and fell into the next module. The thing skittered toward him, rounded a support, and its head pulsed. A projectile flew at Zilf, but he easily ducked out of the way. Instead of waiting for another, he dropped through the missing panel and into the next module.